A little girl tugged at Caroline's sleeve, pointed at her cross necklace, and asked a question so simple yet so powerful that it brought tears to her eyes. Karoline Leavitt stood near a folding table stacked with pamphlets, smiling as she shook hands and answered questions. She had always enjoyed events like these, not for the attention, but for the conversations, the real, unfiltered stories people shared with her, the quiet moments of honesty that reminded her why she did what she did. As she chatted with an older woman about local schools, she felt a light tug at her sleeve. At first, she thought nothing of it, but the tug came again, persistent and small. She turned and glanced down. A little girl stood there, barely 7 years old, with chestnut curls that framed her round, freckled face. She clutched the hem of her floral dress, her wide brown eyes locked on Caroline's necklace. Caroline crouched down, leveling herself with the child. "Hey there," she said softly, offering a warm smile. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, then answered just as quietly, "Samantha." "Well, it's nice to meet you, Samantha." The child's gaze didn't waver. Instead, she pointed a small, slightly trembling finger at the delicate gold cross resting against Caroline's collarbone. "What does your necklace mean?" The room around them didn't go silent. Not really, but to Caroline, the air shifted. The question was simple, innocent, and yet it carried a weight she hadn't expected. For years, that cross had rested against her skin, close to her heart. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a reminder, a marker of something bigger than herself. And for the first time in a long time, someone was asking her to explain it. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, her mind took her somewhere else, back to a night she had spent years trying to forget. But some memories don't fade, no matter how much you wish they would. Caroline blinked, still kneeling before the little girl, but her mind was elsewhere. Years in the past, in a moment that had shaped her in ways she had never imagined. She had been 19, a freshman at Belmont University in Nashville, excited about her future, but struggling more than she let on. Back then, she was trying to balance classes, 2 part-time jobs, and the nagging feeling that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong. Her parents had always raised her in faith, but in that season of her life, it felt distant. She went through the motions, Sunday services, whispered prayers before bed, but it all felt hollow, like she was speaking into an empty room. Then the phone call came. It was just after midnight, the dorm room dimly lit by the glow of her laptop screen. She had been cramming for an exam when her phone vibrated. She almost didn't answer, but something told her she should. The moment she heard her mother's voice, she knew. Her grandmother, the woman who had taught her how to bake biscuits from scratch, who always smelled like lavender, and who spoke about faith like it was as real as the ground beneath their feet, was gone. A sudden heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. Caroline barely remembered the next few hours. She only recalled the quiet sobs of her roommate in the background, the icy numbness in her chest, and the suffocating weight of realizing she would never hear her grandmother's voice again. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. The next morning, she went through the motions, packed a bag, booked a bus ticket home, but her hands felt disconnected from her body, like she was watching someone else live her life. When she arrived at her childhood home, everything felt wrong. Her grandmother's chair sat empty. The air felt heavy, thick with things left unsaid. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered into her grandmother's bedroom. The scent of lavender still lingered, clinging to the blankets and pillows. On the nightstand, a single object caught her eye. A delicate gold chain, the cross pendant resting against the worn pages of a Bible. Her grandmother had worn that necklace every day of her life. Caroline picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. Something about it stopped her in her tracks. The weight of it in her palm felt different, like it wasn't just jewelry, but something more. Something she wasn't ready to understand yet. But sometimes faith finds you before you're ready for it. Caroline stood in the dim light of her grandmother's bedroom, clutching the cross necklace so tightly that the edges pressed into her palm. She expected to feel comfort, but instead she felt anger. How could God take someone like her grandmother, someone so full of love, so steady in her faith, and leave Caroline here, drowning in questions she didn't know how to answer? She had heard people talk about finding peace in loss, about trusting that everything happens for a reason, but that night, none of it made sense. She slipped the chain over her head anyway, letting the pendant rest against her chest. It was cold at first, unfamiliar. Then, as if the weight of it suddenly became too much to bear, she broke down. Tears came hard and fast, shaking her entire body as she sank onto the bed. It wasn't quiet, dignified crying. It was the kind of grief that rips through you, leaving you raw and breathless. She curled into herself, pressing her forehead against the fabric of her grandmother's quilt, the scent of lavender still clinging to it. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, but at some point she whispered, maybe to herself, maybe to God, if he was even listening. If you're real, if you're really out there, I need to know. I need to feel something, anything, because right now, I feel nothing at all. The silence that followed was deafening. No voice from the heavens, no sudden burst of warmth or clarity, just the distant hum of crickets outside the window and the occasional creak of the old house settling. She should have felt foolish. She should have gotten up, wiped her face, and told herself to move on. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed there, waiting. And then something happened. It wasn't a voice or a vision, not the kind of thing you read about in storybooks. It was something smaller, a shift, barely noticeable but unmistakable. Her heart, which had felt like it was tearing itself apart moments before, slowed. The tightness in her chest didn't disappear, but it loosened just a little. Her breathing, ragged and uneven, steadied. And somewhere deep inside, where only she could feel it, a whisper of warmth settled into the coldest parts of her. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. For the first time since she had picked up the phone that night, she wasn't drowning anymore. She pulled the crossed necklace between her fingers, staring at it through tear-blurred vision. It had belonged to her grandmother, but somehow in that moment, it felt like it had found her instead. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if her faith would ever feel the way it had when she was a child, unquestioning and easy. But she knew one thing: she wasn't alone, and that was enough to keep going.